Tonight's story is about a woman whose quiet strength often went unnoticed by the very people closest to her. Her name is Bailey Morgan, 32 years old, a single mother raising her little boy Eli with nothing but determination, sacrifice, and love. To her family, she was the warning, the one who strayed off the golden path. But to her son, she was the entire world. One evening, at what was supposed to be a celebration of love, her cousin's engagement dinner, Bailey found herself facing the same silent judgments she had carried for years. But what unfolded that night would change everything. This is where her story begins, survivor of more storms than I can count. Every introduction of myself feels like a stripped-down resume of survival rather than a biography of pride. When people ask what I do, I give them the same answer I've rehearsed. I work 2 jobs, and at night I pick up freelance work just to keep my son Eli and me afloat. That is the truth, though it's only the surface. Beneath that surface is a rhythm that most people never hear. The hum of exhaustion, the silent victories of paying rent on time, the nightly prayers that my boy will never feel less loved because his mother walks this road alone. Life hasn't been gentle, but hardship has taught me resilience. It's a strange thing, how being broken in places can also make you unbreakable. I have learned to sew myself back together with threads no one else notices. Laughter with Eli over burned pancakes, whispered bedtime stories after 12-hour shifts, small celebrations for bills paid with coins scraped together. This is my foundation. This is what people don't see when they look at me and assume the worst. The night everything shifted began with an invitation. Thick cream cardstock, gold lettering, elegant enough to belong on a magazine cover. It was my cousin Madison Clark's engagement dinner. Madison, always the star of our family constellation. She was the one bathed in applause, the one teachers, relatives, even neighbors used as a yardstick. She was the achiever, the golden girl. And me? I was the shadow standing behind her shine, the example whispered about when someone wanted to caution their children against wrong turns. The truth? I hadn't spoken to Madison in half a year. Not since the baby shower where she joked, loud enough for everyone to hear, that I'd collected diapers and regrets instead of degrees and dreams. I smiled through it that day, pretended it didn't hurt, because that's what peacekeeping daughters do. But the sting settled deep, like a shard of glass you never remove. When her invitation arrived, I stared at it for days. It felt less like a gesture of inclusion and more like a test. Will she show her face? Will she stand quietly at the margins like she always does? My mother called 3 times urging me to go. Just show up, Bailey. Smile. Be polite. Don't cause a scene. That was her eternal advice, a script she believed would keep me safe from judgment. But I had long realized that politeness doesn't shield you from cruelty. It only makes you easier to dismiss. Still, I agreed. For her, for appearances, for Eli. Maybe part of me hoped it would be different this time. Maybe part of me still wanted a family I could belong to. The preparation felt like a performance of its own. I pulled out my nicest dress, though it was wrinkled from too many seasons folded away. A little tighter than I remembered. Heels borrowed from a neighbor, a shade too big but polished enough to pass. Eli insisted on choosing my necklace. He handed me a small silver heart, saying, "It looks like mine." His words cut through the fatigue like sunlight. Children see us not through the cracks, but through the hole. To him, I was never less. I was his world. We arrived at the restaurant hand in hand. It was the kind of place that whispers wealth in every detail. White tablecloths starched stiff, dim lights carefully designed to flatter, wine glasses sparkling like trophies. I felt the weight of stares before anyone spoke. The smiles were rehearsed, the greetings practiced, but beneath them hummed the current of judgment. Families have a way of assigning roles and keeping you in them. Tonight, I was the tolerated guest, the single mother whose mistakes were easier to laugh at than to understand. I could already feel myself shrinking at that long table. The polished mahogany stretched between us like a battlefield disguised as civility. Madison floated around the room, glowing in a satin dress worth more than my monthly rent, dispensing air kisses like confetti. I sat quietly near my mother and Aunt Lorraine, who chattered about her dog's Halloween costume as though my entire identity began and ended with Eli. Invisible, forgettable. But I smiled, because that's what years of being told don't cause a scene had trained me to do. Here's the thing. Society often pretends to celebrate resilience, yet it quietly punishes those who live it daily. Single mothers like me are caught in a paradox. We're called strong, but treated like failures. In America, 1 in 4 children is raised by a single parent, yet the stereotype remains: a woman abandoned, unworthy, pitied, or mocked. We live in a culture that applauds independence when it comes with diplomas and promotions, but scorns it when it's forced by circumstance and carried on weary shoulders. That night, I felt those statistics alive in the room. Every polite glance that slid past me, every compliment that stopped short of sincere, every reminder that I didn't fit the script, they were all part of a larger story society tells about women like me. Stories written without our voices, reducing us to cautionary tales rather than testaments of strength. But what I didn't know as I sat there, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of my dress and forcing my posture upright, was this: I wasn't going to leave that dinner broken. The script they'd written for me was about to unravel. The laughter they rehearsed at my expense would curdle in their throats. And for the first time in years, I would not be the one shrinking. The room itself would shift. The spotlight would change. And in that unlikely moment, dignity would find its voice. The seating chart told the story before the evening even began. I was placed at the far end of the long table, right beside my mother and Aunt Lorraine, as if someone had calculated the safest place to tuck me away. Aunt Lorraine, bless her oblivious heart, spent the first 10 minutes showing me photos of her Pomeranian dressed in a pumpkin costume. I nodded politely, though inside I knew what it meant. I wasn't expected to participate in the evening. I was background, a placeholder. My existence, in their eyes, was no larger than the square frame of a Halloween snapshot. Madison, meanwhile, floated across the room like she was born to rule it. The fabric of her satin dress caught the light as though it were stitched with applause. Her smile, wide and effortless, drew people in the way fire attracts moths. She kissed cheeks, complimented shoes, laughed a little too loudly at jokes she probably didn't hear. Watching her was like watching a performance perfected over years, every gesture rehearsed, every glance calculated. She knew her role, and she relished it, the golden bride-to-be, adored without question. When Madison finally acknowledged me, it was with a politeness so sharp it cut deeper than outright cruelty. "You came alone?" she asked, eyebrows arched. "Just me and Eli," I answered steadily, not allowing my voice to waver. "Oh, well, the kids' table is that way," she replied, already turning away before I could respond. Her words lingered in the air like smoke, choking but invisible. It wasn't just a jab, it was a reminder of my assigned place, both literally and figuratively. I was to sit quietly, tolerate the whispers, and be grateful for the invitation. My mother leaned in as if to soothe me, whispering, "Keep your head down. You look nice tonight." Nice. Not beautiful. Not radiant. Just nice. That was the ceiling I was allowed to reach, a woman stripped of possibility, reduced to something pleasant enough to overlook. To them, single mothers weren't meant to shine. We were meant to endure quietly, politely, invisibly. Eli, at least, was spared from the subtle cruelty. He sat at the kids' table, blissfully coloring spaceships on a napkin, his giggles bubbling like spring water. He was untouched by the sharp glances and muted judgments that bounced around the adult table. Watching him reminded me why I stayed, why I bit my tongue. I wanted him to see me belong, even if I didn't feel it. I wanted him to have one night where family meant safety, even if it was a lie. The conversation around me swirled with shallow pleasantries. Relatives who hadn't called me in years suddenly wanted to offer advice on raising a child, budgeting, or dating the right kind of men. I passed the butter. I offered smiles, and I endured. But beneath every glass raised, beneath every polite toast, there was an undercurrent of judgment so loud it drowned out the clinking of silverware. I was tolerated, not accepted. To them, I wasn't a story worth telling. I was a warning whispered behind closed doors. Sociologists often talk about the family role effect, the way we get cast into roles that stick, regardless of who we become. Madison was the achiever, the beacon. I was the failure, the example of what not to do. And what's worse, families rarely let you rewrite your role. They freeze you in place like a photograph from years ago, blind to the fact that people grow, adapt, and rise from ashes. I wasn't just living my life. I was battling an entire narrative my family had constructed about me. It's not just personal. Studies show that single mothers are one of the most stigmatized groups in modern society. In casual conversations, we're either pitied or mocked, rarely celebrated. People assume irresponsibility, failure, even moral weakness, without ever considering the strength it takes to raise a child alone. I had read those statistics before, but sitting there, I didn't need numbers to tell me the truth. I felt it in every glance, every dismissive word. I was the living embodiment of their unspoken bias. The irony was that none of them knew the nights I'd stayed awake stitching hope into Eli's future. They didn't see the hours I spent rewriting my resume after midnight, the pennies I stretched to buy him a toy, the dreams I put on hold so he could have his. To them, my sacrifice was invisible. My love was invisible. My worth was invisible. And yet, I remained seated. Not because I was weak, but because I was stronger than they could imagine. I wasn't staying for their approval. I was staying for Eli, for the girl I used to be who still believed that family was supposed to mean something. Deep down, I hoped, irrationally, maybe, that if I smiled enough, if I played along enough, someone would finally see me. But another part of me knew the truth. They didn't want to see me. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me small. And for far too long, I had given them exactly that. But as the candles flickered lower and the laughter grew sharper, I felt something stir inside me. A realization, fragile but undeniable. Silence was not peace, it was complicity. And every time I swallowed their condescension, I allowed them to define me. The weight of their shadow grew heavier because I kept shrinking beneath it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew at that moment, was that the evening was about to shift. The carefully maintained hierarchy, the unspoken roles, the cruel balance of power, all of it would soon be disrupted. The dinner that began as another night of shallow smiles and quiet suffering would become something else entirely. And though I didn't yet understand how, I sensed it. The silence that had been my cage was on the verge of cracking. The moment came just as the main course plates were cleared, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine. Madison rose with that same flawless grace she had been trained to perfect since childhood. Her diamond ring caught the dim light like a camera flash, commanding attention without her even having to ask for it. She tapped her champagne flute with the silver fork, and the room obeyed. Silence, anticipation, admiration. She began her speech with the polished ease of someone accustomed to admiration. I just want to say how grateful I am to be surrounded by so much love tonight, she said, her voice smooth, each word draped in elegance. Polite applause followed, the kind that doesn't come from the heart, but from habit. A few cheers echoed faintly, practiced responses to a performance they'd seen before. But then, her eyes drifted toward me, slowly, calculated, like a predator choosing the moment to strike. A smile curled on her lips, but it wasn't kindness, it was something sharper, colder. I hope, she said with a half laugh, I never end up like some people, single, pushing 30, raising a kid alone. The room erupted, not in gasps or shocked silence, but in laughter. Loud, unrestrained, comfortable laughter. It wasn't the awkward chuckle you give when someone crosses a line. It was wholehearted amusement, cruel and careless. The sound ricocheted off the walls, filling every corner until it pressed against my chest. My uncle Reuben, her father, slapped the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. You know what they say, he added with a grin. Men don't want used goods. That's just how it is. More laughter. Real, ugly laughter. Even my mother. She gave a small, muffled chuckle, hiding it behind her hand as though that made it softer, less painful. But it didn't. it cut the deepest. That sound, from the woman who brought me into this world, confirmed what I had always feared. My own mother thought I was less. I froze. My skin burned hot while my chest thudded violently, my heart beating against my ribs as if it were trying to escape. I couldn't lift my eyes. My napkin, once neatly folded on my lap, was clenched so tightly in my hand that the fabric twisted into a knot. I stared at it because staring at anything else felt unbearable. Across the room, Eli remained blissfully unaware. His little head bent over his napkin spaceship, crayons scattered, tongue poking out in concentration. My boy, building galaxies while his mother was dismantled in real time. I wanted to vanish, to disappear from that room entirely. For his sake, I wished he would never notice, never feel the shame they wanted me to drown in. Not one voice spoke up. Not one person said, "That's enough." Even those who shifted in their chairs uncomfortably chose silence. And silence, I realized, was worse than cruelty. Cruelty declares itself, but silence permits it. Their silence told me I was the assigned scapegoat, the family's cautionary tale. Challenging that role would be too inconvenient for them. Madison, satisfied with the eruption, moved on to another joke, something about Dylan, her fiancé, giving up video games and how he wouldn't survive marriage without her telling him what to wear. The laughter this time was thinner, but it still came. People shifted in their chairs, sipping wine, pretending they weren't complicit. But the sting of her earlier words still hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Aunt Lorraine leaned in, her voice syrupy but dismissive. "Oh, honey, don't take it personally. Madison just likes to be the center of attention." But it wasn't about attention. No, this was about power, about hierarchy, about ensuring everyone remembered the invisible line between Madison, the golden girl, and me, the disappointment. My entire existence had been reduced to a punchline. Psychologists say that laughter in groups reinforces belonging. It bonds people together, even at the expense of someone else. In that moment, the laughter wasn't just about Madison's cruelty. It was a ritual, a communal reminder of where I stood. They laughed not only at me, but also for each other, to confirm they were safe, that they were not me. And as I sat there, hands trembling, throat tight, I thought about standing up, about throwing my napkin down, unleashing every truth I had swallowed over the years, storming out in righteous fury. For a split second, I could see it, the satisfaction of refusing to be their entertainment, the blaze of walking away tall. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sat still, my face calm, though inside my mind screamed, because I realized something that pierced deeper than the laughter. Their love, their respect, their validation. It all came with conditions, with silence, with shame. And if I wanted to be accepted, I had to keep shrinking. But even as my chest burned with humiliation, I whispered to myself, unheard by anyone but me, I am not what they say I am. I thought of Eli, just a few feet away, safe in his galaxy of crayons and stars. And I promised myself that their laughter, their mockery, would not become the truth of who I was. What I didn't know in that moment, what none of them anticipated, was that someone else in that room had heard every word, and he was not going to let it stand. The laughter that echoed around me was about to choke into silence, because one voice, an unexpected voice, was preparing to break the pattern. The room was still humming with low laughter, wine glasses clinking, chairs shifting, when the sound of something unexpected sliced through it. Not a word at first, but the scrape of a chair. Madison's fiancé, Dylan, rose from his seat. For a moment, everyone assumed he was headed to the bathroom or the bar. But he didn't turn that way. He walked the length of the table, slow and deliberate, every step breaking the rhythm of the evening. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Conversations cut short. Even Madison faltered mid-sentence, her polished smile stiffening into confusion as she watched him move past her. He stopped right beside me. My breath caught, and for a split second, I wondered if he had come to ask me to leave. But then he spoke, his voice calm yet steady, the kind of tone that carried without ever needing to be raised. "I think they should know something," he said. The laughter died instantly. Silence thickened the air. Real silence, the kind that feels heavy, like the walls themselves are listening. Madison blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for anything outside her script. Uncle Reuben lowered his glass, his grin fading. My mother, for the first time that evening, actually looked at me instead of through me. Dylan turned his body to face the room, and his next words landed like stones on glass. "That wasn't just a joke," he said, his eyes on Madison. "That was cruel." Madison's smile faltered, but before she could respond, Dylan raised his hand gently, not aggressively, but firmly enough to hold the moment. "No," he said. "I need to say this." His gaze swept the table, locking eyes with relatives who had laughed moments earlier. "You all treat Bailey like she's some kind of failure, like her life is something to mock. But what you don't know is that she's the strongest person in this room." I froze. My napkin slipped from my hand. My breath trembled as if afraid to believe him. 2 years ago, Dylan continued, I lost my job. I was laid off, and I fell hard. I spiraled. Depression, drinking more than I should, nights where getting out of bed felt impossible. Madison told me to snap out of it. Reuben said I was weak. He paused, his eyes hardening as he looked toward Madison's father. But Bailey checked in on me every single week. She didn't just offer kind words, she gave her time. She helped me rewrite my resume. She connected me with someone she knew in HR. She even babysat my niece so I could attend interviews. She barely knew me, and still, she showed up when no one else did. The silence deepened. Even the waitstaff had stilled, holding trays mid-air. I stared at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. He turned to me then, his eyes steady, his voice softening. You didn't want credit. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just helped. And you helped me out of something dark. Turning back to the table, his tone sharpened again. So when you laugh at her, You're not just laughing at a single mom. You're mocking the person who helped me rebuild my life. You're mocking real strength." The words hit the room like a storm surge, sweeping away the thin veil of comfort. Faces shifted, cousins staring into wine glasses as if they might hold answers, aunts clearing throats nervously, even my mother sitting rigid with her hands clenched. The same people who had laughed minutes before now seemed suddenly aware of their silence.
Madison shot to her feet, fury replacing her composure. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Are you trying to embarrass me?" Dylan didn't flinch. "No," he said evenly. "You did that on your own?" Gasps rippled across the table. No one dared speak above it.
Madison's eyes narrowed, her face tightening with rage, but Dylan's voice cut through her fury like a scalpel. "I'm done smiling through shallow compliments and fake toasts. I won't sit here and watch someone good get torn down just to make you feel bigger." The room seemed to tilt. Power had shifted, and everyone felt it. For the first time that night, Madison wasn't in control. She tried to claw it back with a desperate question. "Do you have feelings for her?" Her words hung in the air, thick with accusation. Dylan looked at her with disbelief, almost pity. "I have respect for her," he replied, his tone unwavering. "Deep respect. And if you spent less time performing perfection and more time actually listening, maybe you'd understand why that matters." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter had been. Because his words weren't just about me. They were about all of us. About what we choose to protect and what we choose to ridicule. About who we celebrate and who we erase. Dylan had peeled back the veneer of the evening and exposed the raw truth beneath it. For the first time in my adult life, someone stood up for me, not behind closed doors, not in hushed texts after the fact, but right there in the open, in front of everyone who had ever looked down on me. He had turned their spotlight away from my shame and cast it on their cruelty. And in that moment, I wasn't the punchline anymore. I wasn't the disappointment. I was seen. The air in that restaurant no longer buzzed with laughter or shallow chatter. It was heavy now, thick with the weight of truth that Dylan had laid bare. Madison remained standing, her satin dress gleaming under the lights, but her face betrayed her fury, cheeks flushed, lips pressed tight, eyes darting around the room in search of an ally. For the first time all evening, no one rushed to her side. Even Uncle Reuben, who had roared with laughter moments earlier, stared down into his wine glass, muttering something about Dylan being too emotional. But his words fell flat. No one laughed. No one agreed. Dylan's voice carried across the silence. "You want to talk about emotion?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Let's talk about what it takes to raise a child alone, to work 2 jobs, to give your time to someone else without ever asking for anything in return. That's not weakness. That's strength." Every word struck deeper than the last. Madison tried to interject, to reclaim her stage. "You're making this about her," she snapped. Dylan didn't waver. "No," he said softly, but firmly. "You already did. I'm just not letting you get away with it."
Then he turned to me.
His eyes softened, his voice lowered, but the whole room could still hear.
You didn't deserve that. Any of it.
I wanted to respond, to say thank you, to tell him how much it meant, but my throat tightened. My voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. All I could do was nod. And in that simple gesture, I felt something inside me shift, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. My mother looked at me then, really looked. For years, she had told me to keep my head down, to smile politely, to stay small so as not to disturb the waters. But now her eyes glistened with something unfamiliar. Regret. Maybe she finally saw what her silence had cost. Maybe she realized that by laughing softly, by whispering, "Just be nice," she had stood with the mockery instead of with me. I didn't expect an apology. Not from her, not from Madison, not from anyone. But for the first time, I didn't need one. I could feel the weight lifting, the burden of waiting for validation from people who had never truly seen me. Dylan didn't touch me. He didn't try to play the savior. He simply stood there, close enough to say without words, "You are not alone." That quiet presence was worth more than 1,000 apologies. And in that stillness, I realized something profound. They hadn't broken me. They had only revealed themselves. I straightened in my chair, taller than I had ever sat before. Not in anger, not in shame, but in quiet strength. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of people who had once reduced me to whispers and warnings. Madison sat rigid, trembling with rage rather than embarrassment. Reuben sipped his wine like nothing mattered. My mother's hands trembled against her glass, but none of it touched me anymore. I wasn't there for them. I was there for Eli. I turned toward him. He looked up from his spaceship drawing, his grin as wide as the stars he had been coloring. His world was still intact, untouched by the cruelty that had tried to break mine. "Ready to go home, baby?" I asked gently. He nodded and slipped his small hand into mine without hesitation. That was all I needed. That was everything. We didn't say goodbye. We didn't need to. As we walked past Dylan, he gave me a slight nod. Not dramatic, not grand, just a quiet acknowledgement. You mattered. You were seen. I carried Eli's drawing in one hand, his warm fingers in the other, and together we stepped out into the night. The air outside wasn't cold, it was light, almost buoyant, as though something had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't leave in defeat. I left in full. Strength, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is choosing to show up when you know you'll be judged. Sometimes it is holding your ground when everyone else expects you to shrink. And sometimes strength is walking away with dignity when others want you broken. Madison thought that night belonged to her. She thought she could humiliate me, using my life as a punchline to draw the spotlight closer. But she misunderstood the nature of power. Real power doesn't come from controlling the room. It comes from telling the truth without apology. And Dylan, by standing up in that moment, reminded everyone that silence is complicity. But one honest voice can shift everything. As Eli and I walked into the night, I carried more than his drawing. I carried the knowledge that I didn't need anyone's permission to exist fully, to stand tall, to be more than their story about me. I had always been enough. They had just never cared to see it. But I did. And that was all I needed.
So if you've ever been the outsider, the quiet one, the one mocked for not fitting the mold, remember this. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your shame. The most unforgettable revenge isn't cruelty returned. It's dignity claimed. It's living your truth without fear. That night, my family saw me differently, not because I had changed, but because I had stopped shrinking. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they mistake silence for weakness, they'll think twice. Because silence can be strength too, but only when it's chosen, not when it's forced. I was no longer the punchline. I was the story worth telling. Bailey's journey reminds us that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's the quiet choice not to shrink, even when the world tries to make you small. And sometimes, the most unforgettable revenge is simply living your truth with dignity. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We wish you and your family good health, happiness, and the courage to always believe in your own worth. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because every story has the power to reflect a part of our own lives.